I found out I was not invited to Christmas the same day a $25,000 bill landed in my inbox. My son did not ask. He assumed. The message was clean, polite, final, and it made one thing painfully clear. I was optional at the table, but essential at the bank. Years of quiet help had hardened into expectation, and my silence had trained it. In that moment, something broke that could not be explained away. This is the story of how love became leverage and how stepping back hurt less than disappearing when I finally chose myself. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink. This is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Hale. I am 62 years old, and I live alone in Asheville, North Carolina, in a small wooden house tucked into the quiet slope of a mountain road. The mornings here arrive gently. Light moves across the kitchen counter before I do, and the air always smells faintly of pine and damp earth. After my husband died 3 years ago, I learned how much silence a life can hold without collapsing. I did not fall apart the way people expect widows to. I reorganized. I adjusted. I kept going. I retired not long after his passing, closing the door on a career that had shaped me for more than 3 decades. I was an accountant for over 30 years, the kind who double-checked columns even when the numbers already matched. I believed in planning, in preparation, in making sure there was always enough set aside for what might come next. That instinct followed me into retirement. My finances were steady. My days were structured. I knew where I stood. My home is modest, but it is mine. A narrow porch, a small garden behind the house, and a kitchen I know so well I can move through it in the dark. I spend my mornings tending plants or reading the paper, and my evenings are quiet by choice. Loneliness and solitude are not the same thing, and I learned that difference slowly. I did not rush to fill the space my husband left behind. I let it settle. I have one child, my son Daniel. He lives in Charlotte, North Carolina, about 2 hours away with his wife, Lauren. Daniel has always been ambitious, always reaching for the next step before his footing was fully secure. When his father was alive, they balanced each other out. After the funeral, that balance shifted. Daniel called every day at first, checking in, asking how I was holding up. During one of those calls, he mentioned money was tight. I did not wait for him to ask. I offered help because it felt natural. That was how it began. I paid part of the mortgage 1 month, then another. When unexpected expenses came up, I stepped in. I never asked for repayment, and I never set a timeline. I told myself it was temporary, that they were just finding their footing. Supporting my son did not feel like sacrifice. It felt like continuity, like something familiar in a life that had already changed too much. Lauren was polite, appreciative in the way people are when they assume help will always be there. We were cordial, if not especially close. I did not mind. My focus was Daniel, making sure he did not feel alone in the way I had after losing my husband. I believed that easing his burden was part of my role as a mother. I had the means. I had the discipline. I saw no reason not to. Over time, the help became routine. The transfers happened quietly, without discussion. I told myself that families do not keep score, that love does not need boundaries. I believed that being reliable was the same as being valued. From where I stood, everything seemed stable. My life was simple, my finances were in order, and my relationship with my son appeared intact. I did not yet understand how easily generosity can become expectation or how silence can be mistaken for agreement. At that point, I thought I knew exactly who I was in my family and why I was there. I believed my place was secure. If you're still watching and starting to sense where this is heading, comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Because what looked like love and support at first is about to take a turn that no one saw coming. Now, let's move on to Chapter 2. December arrived quietly in Asheville, the way it always does, without ceremony. The mornings grew colder, the light thinner, and my routine settled into their winter rhythm. I checked my email after breakfast each day, more out of habit than necessity. Most messages were predictable: utility statements, newsletters I never read, reminders I archived without opening. That morning felt no different until I saw an unfamiliar sender sitting between a grocery receipt and a charity update. The email came from a car dealership in Charlotte, North Carolina. The subject line was neutral, administrative, the kind that usually means nothing to me. What caught my attention was the list of recipients. My son Daniel's name was there, neatly copied, as if this message had already passed through him before reaching me. I opened it slowly, still assuming there had been some mistake. There was no greeting, no explanation, just a short line stating that an outstanding balance required attention, followed by an attachment. The invoice itself was clean and professional, laid out in careful columns. At the bottom, bold and unmistakable, was the total, 25,000 United States dollars. The due date was December 31st. I did not panic. I did not reach for the phone. Instead, I sat very still, reading the page again as if the numbers might rearrange themselves. My mind did what it always did when confronted with financial information. It checked for context. It looked for authorization. It searched for a decision point I could remember crossing. There was none. I closed the file, then opened it again, waiting for recognition that never came. Later that week, Daniel called. His voice sounded busy, distracted, layered with background noise I did not recognize. He told me that this year would be different. Lauren's parents were flying in, along with her sister. The house would be full, he said. It might be easier if I stayed home for Christmas. He spoke gently, as if he were making a thoughtful suggestion. I listened without interrupting, aware of how quickly decisions can be framed as kindness when they are already made. I told him I understood. The word came easily, the way it always had. After we hung up, I stood in my kitchen longer than necessary, staring at the calendar pinned beside the refrigerator. The square around Christmas Day looked no different than the others, but I felt something shift. The timing stayed with me. The invoice, the call. 2 separate events, close enough together to feel connected even before I could explain why. I told myself I was being sensitive, that families adjust, that circumstances change. Still, the feeling lingered. It was not anger. It was not hurt. It was the quiet recognition of being repositioned. I thought back over the years, over how often I had stepped in without being asked, how rarely my involvement had been discussed out loud. I had grown used to being the steady presence in the background, the one who made things easier by not complicating them. That role had always come with a sense of belonging. Now, for the first time, it felt conditional. That evening, I reopened the email and looked again at Daniel's name in the recipient list. It was a small detail, but it mattered. I was not being consulted. I was being informed. The assumption was already in place, quiet and confident. I did not call him back that night. I did not reply to the email. I told myself there would be time to sort it out, that clarity would come with conversation. Still, as I turned off the lights and went upstairs, I knew this was not an isolated misunderstanding. It was the first visible crack in something I had long believed was solid. If you're still here and felt that quiet shift, something felt off but no one said it out loud, comment number 2 below. The next chapter is where assumptions turn into expectations, and that is where the real trouble begins. Let's continue with chapter 3. I waited 2 days before calling Daniel, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted the conversation to stay grounded. I had spent enough years smoothing things over to know that timing mattered. When I finally picked up the phone, I was calm, seated at the kitchen table with the invoice printed and folded beside me. I expected confusion, maybe even an apology. What I did not expect was how prepared he sounded. Daniel answered on the second ring. He did not ask why I was calling. He seemed to know. I told him I had received an email from a car dealership and that there appeared to be a bill attached to it. I said it plainly, without accusation, giving him space to explain. There was a brief pause, not the kind that suggests surprise, but the kind that signals a transition. He spoke as if he were filling in details I had simply missed. The car, he said, was necessary. Lauren needed something reliable. Their old vehicle was not dependable anymore, and with work schedules and family responsibilities, they could not afford to take chances. He talked about safety, about practicality, about planning ahead. His tone was reasonable, steady, almost rehearsed. As he continued, I realized he was not answering my question. He was justifying a decision. I waited for him to mention when we had discussed it, for him to ask if I was comfortable with the amount, or even to acknowledge that it was a large sum. None of that came. Instead, he reminded me that I had always said I would help if they needed it. He said it the way people quote a promise they believe is binding. I asked him when the purchase had been finalized. He hesitated, then said they were already in the process. The paperwork was nearly complete. The dealership was just waiting on the remaining balance. That was when the shape of the situation became clear. The decision had been made. The expectation had been set. My role was not to decide, but to complete. I felt something tighten in my chest, not from anger, but from recognition. This was not a request. It was a formality. The money was framed as a gap, not a choice. I thought about how often I had stepped in early, how rarely I had insisted on clarity. Each time I had made things easier, I had also made them quieter. Now the silence had worked against me. Daniel did not raise his voice. He did not pressure me openly. He spoke with confidence, as if this were simply the next logical step in a long-standing arrangement. I noticed how little space there was for disagreement. The conversation moved forward without ever checking whether I was willing to follow. I told him I did not remember agreeing to pay for a car. He responded by saying we had talked about helping when needed. He treated my concern like a misunderstanding, something that could be corrected with explanation rather than consent. The distinction mattered to me, even if it did not to him. When the call ended, I stayed at the table, the folded invoice still untouched. I replayed the conversation in my head, listening for moments where I might have missed an opening to stop this earlier. There were many. Each one led back to the same habit. I had made myself reliable without ever making myself visible. This was the first time I understood how my generosity had shifted shape. What I had once offered freely had become something assumed. My presence in their lives had been reduced to what I could provide. I had not been consulted because, in their minds, consultation was unnecessary. I did not feel betrayed yet. That came later. What I felt then was the quiet certainty that something fundamental had changed. The relationship I thought I had with my son was no longer operating on mutual understanding. It was running on expectation. And for the first time, I knew that if I did not interrupt it, it would continue exactly as it was. If you're still watching and realizing this was never just a misunderstanding, comment number 3, so I know you're following closely. Because once the truth comes out, there is no going back to how things were. Let's move on to chapter 4. After that first conversation, I told myself there was still room to handle this quietly. I had spent most of my adult life believing that calm persistence could smooth over almost anything. Conflict, when approached gently, could be softened into understanding. That belief had served me well in my marriage, in my career, and in raising my son. I saw no reason it would fail me now. I waited a day before calling Daniel again. This time, I framed the conversation the way I always had when money came up. I said I needed a little time to think. I suggested we talk again after Christmas, when things were less hectic and everyone had space to breathe. It felt reasonable to me, even generous. I was not refusing. I was asking for consideration. His response shifted almost immediately. The patience from our earlier call was gone, replaced by a tighter edge I recognized from past moments when plans were already in motion. He told me the dealership could not wait. The deadline was firm. Paperwork was already moving forward. Every sentence carried the same message, even when the words were different. There was no room for delay. As he talked, I realized how carefully the pressure was being distributed. He did not say he needed the money. He said other people were waiting. He said expectations had been set. He said that changing course now would create problems that did not need to exist. Each explanation placed responsibility somewhere else, anywhere but on the decision itself. I listened, nodding even though he could not see me. I had done this before. When Daniel felt cornered, I became still. I absorbed the urgency so he would not have to. That pattern had always ended the same way, with me stepping in and things settling down. This time, the familiar rhythm felt wrong. The more he spoke, the clearer it became that my feelings were not part of the calculation. I tried to explain that it was not just about the money. I said the timing mattered. I said I felt caught off guard. He responded by telling me I was overthinking it, that I was making something simple complicated. He reminded me that families help each other and that this was no different from before. The comparison landed heavily. It erased every distinction I was trying to make. What struck me most was how efficiently my discomfort was dismissed. There was no anger in his voice, no cruelty, just impatience, the kind that assumes compliance and is irritated by hesitation. I began to understand that my attempt to keep the peace was being interpreted as resistance, not communication. After we ended the call, I sat alone in the quiet of my living room, replaying the exchange. I noticed how carefully I had chosen my words, how much space I had left for compromise. I also noticed how little of that space had been returned to me. My request for time had not been acknowledged as reasonable. It had been treated as an obstacle. That realization stayed with me through the evening. I folded laundry slowly, made dinner I barely tasted, and avoided looking at my phone. I knew another message would come. I also knew that responding the way I always had would only move things forward in the same direction. For years, my instinct had been to de-escalate, to smooth out tension before it had a chance to grow. Now, that instinct felt outdated. The situation was not escalating because of conflict. It was escalating because of expectation. And no amount of calm explanation was going to change that. By the time I went to bed, I understood something I had not been ready to admit earlier. Trying to keep the peace was no longer neutral. It was costing me clarity. If I continued to handle this the way I always had, I would not just be paying a bill. I would be confirming a role I no longer recognized as my own. If you're still here and wondering how far this pressure can go, comment number 4 below. The next part is where everything finally comes to the surface, and one sentence changes everything. Now, let's continue. The call came 3 days before the end of the year, late enough in the afternoon that the light in my living room had already begun to fade. I recognized Daniel's number and felt a calm settle over me that I did not expect. It was not relief. It was not dread. It was the stillness that comes when something has already decided itself inside you, even if you have not yet said it out loud. He did not waste time. The deadline was close, he said. The dealership had called again. Everything was lined up except the payment. His words moved quickly, one explanation stacked on top of another, as if momentum alone might carry me with him. I listened without interrupting, noticing how familiar this pattern felt and how little power it held over me now. When he paused, I told him I still had not agreed to cover the cost. The silence that followed was heavier than anything he had said. Then he spoke, and his tone shifted in a way that made the moment unmistakable. He said he had not thought I would say no, not with surprise, not with anger, but with genuine confusion, as though refusal had never existed as an option. That sentence rearranged everything. It clarified years of unspoken assumptions in a way no argument ever could. I understood then that my generosity had not just been appreciated, it had been relied upon. My presence in their lives had been measured by its usefulness, not its meaning. Daniel began to explain again, this time with more urgency. He talked about how embarrassing it would be if the purchase fell through. He talked about expectations, about conversations that had already happened with people I did not know. Each word pressed the problem outward, away from the decision itself, and onto the consequences of not fixing it. That was when he said the part he had avoided until then. The bank, he admitted, had declined the loan. Their credit was not strong enough. The dealership had only moved forward because Daniel told them the remaining balance would be taken care of. He did not say my name right away, but it hung there, obvious and undeniable. I had been used as assurance. My agreement had been assumed into existence. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I felt something close to clarity, sharp and clean. For the first time since this began, the situation was fully visible. The pressure I felt was not accidental. It had been built into the plan from the start. As he continued talking, I noticed how much space his words took up and how little room there was for mine. I thought about Christmas, about the ease with which I had been excluded, and how effortlessly my role had been reinserted when money was involved. The contrast was impossible to ignore. I told him I needed time, not to think about the payment, but to understand how we had arrived here. He responded by reminding me of everything I had done before, as if history itself were proof of obligation. That was when I realized that explaining myself would only reinforce the idea that I needed permission to stop. When the call ended, I did not sit down right away. I walked through my house slowly, noticing details I usually took for granted. The quiet did not feel empty. It felt deliberate. I understood that this was not a moment that could be softened or deferred. It was a line, and it had already been crossed. I did not feel betrayed in the dramatic sense. There was no sudden rupture. What I felt was recognition. A long pattern had reached its logical conclusion, and I was standing at the only place it could be interrupted. By the time evening settled fully over the house, I knew this was the point of no return. If I stepped in now, I would not just be paying for a car. I would be confirming a version of myself that no longer fit. The realization was steady, unmistakable, and final. After the call ended, the house returned to its usual quiet, but it felt different this time. The silence no longer waited for me to fill it. It simply existed, steady and unmoving. I stood in the hallway for a long moment, listening to nothing, aware of how rarely I had allowed myself to pause without planning my next response. For years, my instinct had been to act quickly, to smooth the edges before anyone else felt the discomfort. Now there was no urgency inside me, only clarity. I made a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, the same place where I had sorted bills and balanced accounts for decades. Two paths lay in front of me, clean and unmistakable. If I paid the money, everything would settle. The dealership would be satisfied. Daniel would feel relieved. The story they had already told themselves would remain intact. I would be the dependable presence in the background, the solution that appeared just in time. Nothing would change, except that the expectation would deepen. The other path was less familiar. It involved disappointment, confusion, and the kind of tension I had spent most of my life avoiding. Saying no would not come with applause or understanding. It would likely be interpreted as withdrawal, as coldness, as a failure of love. I knew the language well. I had used it myself when I was younger, when I believed that reliability was proof of care. I thought about the years that had led me here, about how often I had stepped in early, before a request was fully formed, how often I had made decisions easier by removing myself from them. Each time I had told myself I was choosing peace. I had not realized that peace, when purchased this way, does not belong to the person who pays for it. My phone lay face down on the table. I did not pick it up. I did not draft a message or rehearse an explanation. I knew how those conversations went. Every explanation became a point of negotiation. Every justification turned into something that could be argued with. I had spent years teaching my son that my boundaries were flexible, that my needs were secondary. I could not undo that with a carefully worded paragraph. Instead, I allowed the quiet to remain. I moved through the house slowly, noticing small details I had overlooked in the days of constant adjustment. The worn edge of the counter, the soft creak of the stairs, the way the late afternoon lights settled on the wall. None of it demanded anything from me. That felt important. I understood then that the decision was not about money. It was about whether I would continue to participate in a version of myself that existed only in relation to someone else's comfort. I had spent years believing that love required constant availability. Now I was beginning to see that love without consent turns into obligation, and obligation erodes choice. I did not call Daniel back that night. I did not answer when my phone buzzed with another message. The silence was deliberate. It was not meant to punish or provoke. It was the first boundary I had drawn without softening its edges. As evening settled in, I felt the familiar tug of guilt, faint but persistent. It passed without taking hold. In its place was something steadier. I was not withdrawing my care. I was reclaiming my agency. The difference mattered more than I had expected. When I went to bed, I did so without rehearsing what I would say the next day. For the first time, there was no script running ahead of me, no plan to repair what might break. I knew that whatever followed would unfold without my intervention. The choice had been made, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the quiet acceptance that I no longer needed to explain myself in order to stop. If you're still watching and felt the weight of that decision, comment number 6 to show you're still with me. Because what comes next are the consequences no one was prepared for. Let's move on to chapter 7. The morning after my decision arrived without drama. I woke at the same time I always did, made coffee, and stood at the kitchen window watching the fog lift from the trees. I expected a surge of doubt or a rush of fear, something sharp to remind me of what I had chosen. Instead, there was a calm that felt unfamiliar but steady, like a room that had finally been cleared of clutter. After breakfast, I called the bank. The woman on the line spoke carefully, walking me through the steps I had taken so many times before, only now in reverse. I asked to stop all recurring transfers. She repeated the account numbers and dates back to me, waiting for hesitation that never came. When she told me it was done, I thanked her and ended the call. The final click of the line sounded clean, almost ceremonial. I did not feel triumphant. There was no sense of victory in it. What I felt was relief, quiet and contained, the kind that comes from closing a door that has been left open too long. I sat for a moment afterward, hands folded, letting the stillness settle without rushing past it. Then I opened the payment application on my phone. I typed Daniel's name, then Lauren's. I entered 10 United States dollars for each transfer. The amount was deliberate. It was the smallest sum that still counted as money, the smallest action that still carried meaning. Before sending it, I wrote one line. I said I could not help financially anymore and that I hoped they would understand. There were no explanations attached, no apologies, just the truth, stated once. The response was immediate. My phone lit up before I had time to set it down. Messages stacked on top of one another, each one sharper than the last. Questions first, then confusion, then irritation. I did not open them. I turned the phone face down on the table and went about my day. By early afternoon, the calls began. I let them ring until they stopped. The quiet in the house remained intact, undisturbed by the urgency on the other end of the line. When I finally picked up my phone again, there was a message from Lauren waiting separately. She wrote that she was confused, that my decision had come out of nowhere. She said I was putting unnecessary strain on the family. She said a mother would not do this. I read the message once, then again. There was no anger in me as I absorbed it, just recognition. In her words, I could see the role I had been playing clearly defined. I was valued as long as I was useful. My presence mattered when it came with solutions attached. The moment I stepped out of that role, I became a problem to be managed. Another call came in, then another. The tone of the messages shifted from confusion to frustration. Someone needed to fix this. Someone needed to make it right. I knew who that someone was supposed to be, and for the first time, I did not move to fill the space. I thought about how often I had rushed to soften situations like this, how quickly I had explained myself in the past to avoid being misunderstood. I did none of that now. I did not owe clarity to people who had not offered me consideration. The consequences unfolding were not accidents. They were the result of choices made without me. As evening approached, the messages slowed. The silence returned, deeper this time, layered with meaning. I made dinner and ate alone, noticing how the absence of obligation felt different from loneliness. There was space in the room, and it belonged to me. When the phone buzzed again, I did not reach for it. I let it rest where it was, screen dark, sound muted. The consequences had arrived, and I was not running from them. For the first time, I was allowing them to exist without trying to fix what they revealed. A few days passed before I heard from Daniel again. The silence between us had changed in texture, no longer sharp or frantic, but tentative, as if both of us were adjusting to unfamiliar ground. I noticed the absence of constant notifications more than I noticed their presence before. My phone stayed quiet on the kitchen counter while I moved through my days without checking it every few minutes. That, too, felt new. When Daniel finally called, his voice sounded different. The urgency that had driven every conversation before was gone, replaced by something unsteady. He did not launch into explanations or timelines. He spoke slowly, as if choosing his words more carefully than usual. The dealership was pressing, he said. Conversations with the Lawrence family had become uncomfortable. Questions were being asked that he did not have easy answers for. I listened without interrupting. For the first time since this began, he was not telling me what needed to be done. He was describing a situation he could not control. The distinction mattered. He was standing inside the problem instead of handing it to me. There was a pause, and then he asked what he should do. The question landed heavily, not because I did not know how to respond, but because I recognized how long he had gone without asking it. For years, the solution had always been assumed. Now, in the absence of that assumption, the responsibility had nowhere else to go. I told him I did not know. The words came out calmly, without hesitation. I did not offer suggestions or alternatives. I did not soften the moment by reminding him of past help. I simply let the answer stand. It was not an act of cruelty. It was an acknowledgement of reality. The choices that led here had not been mine, and fixing them did not need to be either. After we hung up, I sat quietly, aware of a subtle shift taking place. By stepping back, I had not created the gap Daniel was now facing. I had only stopped filling it. That space had always existed, masked by my involvement. Without me in it, the shape of the situation became visible to everyone involved. Over the next few days, I heard less and less. When I did hear from him, it was indirect, brief updates rather than requests. I gathered that he was talking with the dealership, trying to renegotiate terms. He was having difficult conversations with Lauren's parents. None of it sounded easy. None of it was meant to be. I noticed something else during that time. My own days felt lighter. Not because the situation had resolved, but because I was no longer carrying the weight of managing it. I slept better. I moved through my routines without the familiar tightness in my chest. The absence of constant responsibility created room for reflection. I thought about how often I had mistaken involvement for love, how easily care can turn into control when one person is always expected to step in. By refusing to do so now, I was not withdrawing affection. I was allowing my son to encounter the full consequences of his decisions, something I had unintentionally shielded him from for years. Stepping back did not mean I stopped caring. It meant I stopped intervening. The difference was subtle but profound. For the first time, our relationship was being forced to exist without the cushion of my constant availability. As the week drew to a close, I understood that this was not a temporary pause. It was a realignment. Whatever came next would be shaped by choices made in full awareness, not by assumptions quietly carried forward. And for the first time, I felt prepared to let that unfold without inserting myself into the outcome. If you're still here and curious about how this all ends, comment number 8 below. The final chapters reveal what happens when someone finally stops fixing everything and lets the truth stand on its own. Now, let's move toward the conclusion of this story. Christmas morning arrived without an alarm. I woke to a pale light filtering through the curtains and the quiet hum of the house settling around me. There were no early calls, no messages waiting on my phone, no sense of urgency pulling me out of bed. I stayed where I was for a moment, listening to the stillness, noticing how different it felt from the Christmas mornings I had grown used to, filled with anticipation and obligation. I moved through the morning slowly. I made coffee and toasted bread, the simplest breakfast I could imagine, and sat at the kitchen table while steam curled up from my mug. I did not decorate this year. No tree, no lights, not out of sadness, but because I did not feel the need to perform the day for anyone else. The holiday existed whether I marked it loudly or not. At some point, I picked up my phone and placed it face down on the table. It was a small gesture, but a deliberate one. I was not waiting. I was not bracing myself for a last-minute crisis or a change of heart. I let the day unfold on its own terms. Late in the morning, the phone rang once. I watched it light up, Daniel's name flashing briefly before the call went unanswered. A few minutes later, a text followed. It was short and careful. He said they would figure something out. He did not explain how. He did not ask for anything. I read the message, then set the phone back down. I did not feel victorious. I did not feel cruel. What I felt was a quiet acceptance that something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. This was not the Christmas I had imagined earlier in the month, but it was honest. There was no pretense, no unspoken expectation hanging in the air. In the afternoon, I took a walk through the neighborhood. The streets were nearly empty, houses glowing softly behind drawn curtains. I passed families gathered inside, glimpses of movement and laughter visible through windows. I did not feel excluded. I felt separate, and for the first time that separation did not come with shame. Dinner was simple. I cooked for myself and ate without distraction, aware of how much mental space had opened up in the absence of responsibility. The weight I had carried for years was gone, not because it had been resolved, but because it was no longer mine to hold. As evening settled in, I reflected on what this day represented. The relationship with my son was not repaired. There were still conversations that needed to happen, still feelings left unspoken. But the structure had changed. I was no longer positioned as the solution to problems I had not created. Christmas ended quietly, without ceremony. I turned off the lights and went to bed, aware that this chapter had closed, not with celebration or regret, but with a calm understanding that some endings are necessary before anything honest can begin. The days after Christmas passed without incident, and that in itself felt significant. There were no follow-up crises, no urgent messages asking me to step back in. The quiet stretched out, unbroken, and I realized how accustomed I had been to living on alert. For years, part of my attention had always been elsewhere, anticipating the next problem that might need fixing. Now, that vigilance had nowhere to land. I noticed the change in small ways. I woke up without a tight feeling in my chest. I made decisions without mentally checking how they might affect someone else. When I planned my week, I did so based on what I wanted to do, not on what I might be needed for. None of it felt dramatic. It felt normal, which told me how far I had drifted from myself before. What stayed with me most was the clarity. I had spent years believing that love meant making myself available at all costs, that being dependable was the same as being caring. I did not see how easily that belief allowed my kindness to be repurposed into obligation. When help is given without limits, it stops being seen as generosity and starts being treated like a resource. Setting a boundary did not make me cruel. It did not erase my love for my son. It simply told the truth about what I could and could not carry. I did not stop caring when I stopped paying. I stopped disappearing. There is a quiet fear many women my age carry, whether we admit it or not. The fear of becoming unnecessary. The fear that saying no will cost us connection. I believed for a long time that my usefulness was what secured my place in my family. Letting go of that belief was unsettling, but it was also freeing. I do not know what the future holds for my son or his marriage. I do not know how our relationship will continue to change. What I do know is this: love does not require self-erasure. Sacrifice is not the same thing as care, and peace bought with silence is fragile at best. If there is one thing I have learned, it is that boundaries are not punishments. They are markers of respect for others and for ourselves. When I finally drew mine, I did not lose my humanity. I reclaimed it. For the first time in years, my kindness included me. Some stories end with resolution, others with clarity. This one ends with understanding. It reminds us that boundaries are not walls meant to shut people out, but lines that tell the truth about where responsibility belongs. When giving becomes automatic, it quietly loses its meaning. When silence is used to keep peace, it often costs more than conflict ever would. Growth does not always arrive with applause or reconciliation. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the form of relief, steadiness, and the return of self-respect. Learning to step back is not an act of abandonment. It is an act of honesty. And honesty, even when uncomfortable, creates space for relationships to exist on real ground rather than assumption. In the end, choosing yourself does not mean choosing against others. It means choosing a way forward that no longer requires self-erasure. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it resonated with you, please share your thoughts in the comments. Your experiences may help someone else feel less alone. If you found value here, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel so you do not miss future stories like this.